Hello, I'm Rory McKiernan and welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. Love and Courage is independent community-supported media for social change. Thanks to all of you who have been spreading the word and to the fantastic donors and patrons who chip in on an ongoing basis to put fuel in the Love and Courage fire. Together we've helped the podcast hit the #1 spot on iTunes and reach and inspire people all over the world as part of a real community for change. A special thanks to Jen Murphy and Lorraine Cook who recently came on board as monthly patrons. You can find out more about the podcast, send me feedback, inquire about Love and Courage talks, public speaking, coaching and workshops and inspirational events, as well as sign up for the newsletter updates and make a financial contribution, however small, at loveandcourage.org. On Twitter, it's at loveandcourage. I'm also on the hunt for a sponsor, so please let me know if you're interested in coming on board. Again, a huge thanks for your support. It is really appreciated, and I hope you enjoy the podcast.
I'm excited to live in a time when so many people and so many movements are taking the reins themselves, to fight for a better world and leading the way. And it's been a privilege in the job I have now and in the jobs I've had over the last 40 years to be able to provide, some measure of support and solidarity to that.
My guest in this episode is Gara LaMarche, who is one of the world's leading voices on funding and philanthropy for social justice. Gara was the first in his family to go to college and he became the youngest person ever to serve on an ACLU policy committee. During his college years at Colombia, he says he was a reluctant student and spent much of his time teaching at a nursery school in Harlem, which he credits as being one of the most formative experiences of his career. As a former CEO of the Atlantic Philanthropies, a former director of US programs for the Open Society Institute, and now the president of the Democracy Alliance, Gara has overseen the investment of tens of millions of dollars into social justice programs around the world. He has also worked with PEN America and Human Rights Watch and is currently the chair of StoryCorps. I first met Gara several years ago when he was visiting Dublin as part of his work with the Atlantic Philanthropies, and it was great to catch up with him again during my recent visit to New York, where I interviewed him at the StoryCorps offices in Brooklyn. Gara, thank you so much for joining me on the Love and Courage podcast. We're here in the offices of StoryCorps in Brooklyn, where I believe you're the chairperson. And
I am.
I'd love to, if you could tell us a bit about StoryCorps and how you got involved.
Oh, well, StoryCorps started about a dozen years ago. Dave Isay, who's a radio journalist, founded it and just had this very simple idea that if you put two people together in a soundproof booth, and have them talk about things that are important to them, you would get some interesting stories and you'd get the kind of tapestry of American life. And I was aware of it from the weekly broadcasts that StoryCorps does on National Public Radio. But then when I was at the Open Society Foundations and Philanthropy, someone asked me if I would see Dave Isay. This was a year or two into StoryCorps. And they said that StoryCorps really was in danger of going out of business if it didn't get more grants, and would I be willing to meet with Dave Isay? And I said, well, I don't think it really fits, as I understand it, into our guidelines here at Open Society, but I'm happy to give him some advice. So he came to see me, and I insisted I would only give advice, not money, and ended up giving money because I was really attracted to it, and I liked the idea that it didn't fit ultimately into anybody's guidelines, that it was the kind of unmediated voices of people who aren't sufficiently heard. So one thing led to another, and I became a big fan. I supported it when I was at Atlantic Philanthropies, and when I left Atlantic, they asked me if I would be on the board and be the chair. So that's been really a labor of love for me, because StoryCorps, while it enhances the voices of people who are not often heard, it has no particular politics or ideology. And everything I've done in my life has been in the controversial kind of in my activism, from the early days with the American Civil Liberties Union, certainly to the present moment, fighting the Trump administration. And what I liked about StoryCorps, among other things, was that it was something that everybody responds to very positively, and that it's the kind of thing you can go home around the dinner table with your conservative relatives and talk about without getting into an argument. So it's a bit of an outlier in terms of my professional associations. It's not liberal, it's not conservative. It's really just a vehicle through which ordinary people can tell their stories.
I was actually struck by what you said there in terms of Dave getting in touch with Open Society, because I've actually been in touch with Open Society recently, and I was actually seeing could they or would they be interested in supporting Love and Courage in some shape or form. But what I found in this instance and with many funders over the years, there's a very defined and narrow kind of strategic set of objectives, and I respect that. That's a necessity in any business. But you, in that instance, kept an open mind, and you were at least willing to meet Dave and have an open mind. And when I first came across you with Atlantic, you did start with Atlantic Philanthropies, where you led that years ago. You stood out for me because you were at least willing to listen, to try new things, to be a maverick. Is, as you said, that's been a characteristic of your work. Was that the kind of child you were? Was that who you were as a teenager? were you interested in kind of breaking the norms?
Well, it's funny that you say that. When if we get back to the philanthropy thing, I do think that philanthropy has become sharply strategic, and I get that and I respect that. But I look at the things that I did in the 15 years in which I had the privilege of helping rich people like George Soros or Chuck Feeney spend their money. And the things very often I'm most proud of are the things that were reacting to someone else's good idea that might have actually been outside your specific guidelines. I'm a big believer in philanthropy, or in anything really, that values are a better guide to what you ought to do than any particular plan. Sometimes you just have to toss out the plan, but you always have to be in accordance with your basic values. As to me as a kid, yes, I guess I was a little contrarian in some ways. I was for somebody who was an adult, is a big joiner. I'm on a lot of boards. I chair 2 boards. I run big organizations. I have a lot of engagement, public engagement. I have a lot of friends, and a very active social network. When I was a little boy growing up in a small town, Rhode Island, I was close to my brother and my cousin, and maybe one other friend. I went to Catholic schools for my whole childhood until I went to college. I was pretty much of a loner, at least until I got to high school. I was kind of what I guess would now be called a nerdy, geeky kid. I watched a lot of television. I made models. I, went to the library and went through every book in the stacks. I didn't really have much of a social life. I became interested in politics, I guess you would say, as I got older, and followed the elections. And by this time, we're talking about 1968, and a very eventful year when I was just coming into being a teenager. And when I went to high school, all of a sudden there were more kids who were more like me. So I went to school with the same 25 kids in elementary school. And you knew them and they knew you, and it was a good experience. But I was kind of like the kind of short, non-athletic, highly verbal kid, and I did challenge the nuns a bit as I got older and got slapped around a little bit because of it. So I began to have a kind of a contrarian streak. But when I got to high school, this is at the height of the Vietnam War, all of a sudden in a high school of a couple of hundred kids, there were more kids like myself. So I got involved with the debate team in the newspaper, and there were 7 or 8 of us who hung around together who were against the war, and we would, smoke dope behind the school and write, crusading editorials and all of that. So I remember when I was just recently going through stuff I'd written, all these files of articles and speeches over the years, and because we moved offices, and I came across what I believe was the first letter to the editor that I ever had, which was in my hometown newspaper in Westerly, Rhode Island, when I was about 16. And this was whatever year it would have been, 1969, 70, and there was an one movie theater in town. There was an X-rated movie that was playing in the local movie theater. And there was a controversy in town about it, and I wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper defending the rights of free speech, for this movie. I didn't talk to my parents about it or anybody. I sent it in, and all of a sudden it appeared one night in the People's Forum, the local letters column. And I remember my grandfather had died a couple of months before, and my father's reaction was, "Thank God your grandfather is dead." Because I kind of brought notoriety to the family name in a way that they weren't accustomed to. But that was the first of many such occasions.
And can you tell me about your grandfather and your parents, what kind of family you came from?
My grandfather was a pharmacist. It was a small town, so a pharmacist in a small town was a kind of a community figure. Everybody went to get their prescriptions filled. So I grew up in a world where my parents and my grandparents knew everyone in the town. It was about 14,000 people, or seemed to know everybody. My father had grown up having a paper route, so he knew all the houses. Both my parents and all of my relatives, with a few exceptions, have remained in the small town I grew up in. And so while it's gotten bigger and it's harder to know everybody, it seemed to me when I was a kid that my parents knew everybody in the town. My father was a salesman, my mother was a homemaker, my grandfather was a pharmacist. They were very good, decent people. My grandfather died when I was 14, and in those days you had, big families and 17 or 18 grandchildren. So my own relationship with my grandfather was a bit at a distance. You'd go over to the house for a Sunday meal. The number of times that my grandfather and I spent time alone together, I can count on fewer than the fingers of one hand, and yet I admired him in a lot of ways. He was also an amateur photographer, and he had a large pipe collection, and he read a lot, and they were immigrants. My grandparents came to the United States from Canada in the turn of the last century, so their native language was French, and although they were both very fluent in English, they retained an accent. My father was neither of my parents had, or anybody in my family for that matter, had more than a high school education. I was the first generation in my family to go to college. And yet they were highly literate people who read a lot and respected, books and music, and not particularly political. I don't really have any activist history to draw on. Over the years, as I've been very involved in activism, I often work with a lot of people who come by it through their families. They grew up in a left-wing household or something like that. I didn't have that. So when I asked the question of how I became the kind of person that I am, I would say that in part, in a rather strange way, I think my challenging of authority was formed in opposition to the Catholic Church as I found it at that time. So I often say that I grew up in a period of what I call penal code Catholicism, where it seemed to me that as I got older, that the essence of the faith was a set of negative restrictions, mostly having to do with sex, and the Christian charity part of it and the social justice part of it, which I have since come to be aware of, and which resonates strongly for me, didn't seem to be at all part of the church I grew up with. I mean, you could listen to the Gospels and get something out of it, but the sermons and what we were taught seemed to have nothing to do with what I've come to think of as social justice. So I reacted negatively to that, and also the church of the time was, the priests often were rather conservative, and the pastor of our parish spoke in favor of the Vietnam War from the pulpit, and I felt that I didn't want to be part of a captive audience for that. So I stopped going to Mass when I was 14 or 15, although I continued to go to a Catholic high school, which was relatively progressive. And, my parents were not wild about it at the time, because I grew up in an environment where everybody went to church on Sunday, and you worried about their souls if they didn't. But eventually they came to accept it, and in really one or two generations since, there's hardly anybody in my family at any level who remains an active Catholic. But I grew up in a world where it was just a kind of complete immersion. So I would say that in kind of a negative way, my rebelling against the strictures of the church was my first kind of act of intellectual independence. And then, I found my models elsewhere. I happened to be fortunate, I guess you would say, to grow up in a time of roiling activism. So I was affected by the world around me. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson, declined to run for office, and McCarthy and Kennedy, and assassinations of Kennedy and King, and the Tet Offensive, and all these things happening in the same year. had a powerful impression on me. And and it's interesting because we're in this time of Trump and opposition. My formative actual political experiences were in opposing Richard Nixon. So when I got to college in 1972, in 1973, Nixon was dealing with Watergate. He, in this famous so-called Saturday Night Massacre, fired the special prosecutor looking into Watergate, Archibald Cox, and then actually didn't fire him directly, wanted Cox fired, and the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, to their everlasting credit, would not do it. So he put in the next level guy who did the deed and fired Cox. And it backfired ultimately and led to his downfall and his resignation. But it was an outrageous abuse of power at the time, not dissimilar to what we are seeing now with Trump. And so that really agitated me. And the night I was a sophomore in college, on the Saturday night when the act took place. Now, this is in a pre-social media world, right? So I'm watching television and a bulletin comes on, and so I was very upset. And the next morning on campus, there were flyers all around, and someone was calling an emergency meeting in the law school. I went to Columbia University at the law school. So I show up at the meeting, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people there. And, I'm a little dismayed by the rhetoric, which seems kind of disconnected to what's actually needed to do to get rid of Nixon. So I got up and made an impromptu speech that, Nixon had to be impeached, and the way to impeach him was through the 435 congressional districts, and we in this college had students from all over the country, and we could begin grassroots activity. And I made my speech, and then I kind of, I don't say I stormed out, but I left the meeting shortly after that, somewhat frustrated. And 4 or 5 people came out after me into the hall and said, that makes a lot of sense, let's work together. So we formed a little impeachment group, and this is really dates me. This is now 44 years ago, I guess. We set up a card table at the entrance to the campus on 116th Street and Broadway. We bought a World Almanac, which was the only way we could think of to get the addresses and names of all the 435 members of Congress. So we had this World Almanac. We bought paper, envelopes, stamps, and pens, and then we stopped people on the street and asked them to sit down for 5 minutes using the paper that we provided and write a letter to their member of Congress, which they did. And so we generated some hundreds of letters, and we would ask people for a contribution for the stamp. A little local TV station came to cover it. It wasn't the great event in the history of activism, but it was my kind of formative activism. And I often think of that right now because Trump is worse than Nixon in many ways, but there are strange echoes of that time in the current American political moment.
It strikes me as almost an early version of MoveOn.org. You are right. We've come a long way.
Exactly.
But at the
low-tech MoveOn.org. Yeah.
At the same time, Gara, I think there is still something to be said about that, what you might call humble activism in letter writing, because the world of email, anyone can send an email, but is its value as significant as we think it is? Obviously I'm involved in Uplift and many digital organising, but I definitely think there's a lot still to be said for the phone calls and the letters and certainly the... And
also the personal connection. I mean, I think if to put it in an electoral context, I think that our elections are overwhelmed in this country by huge spending on advertising and things like that. And what that really serves is a kind of a consultant media industrial complex. That's why elections are one of the reasons why elections are so expensive. There's increasing evidence, which is really basic, I think, common sense, that knocking on people's doors and engaging them is really the way to build political allegiance and education. And so people need to be in relationship. And so even organizing in elections in this country is all too often done at the last minute by people parachuting in from some other place and going door to door. And everything we know suggests, and the right has done this much better than we have because they often have a network of churches, which is not so much present outside the black church on our side. But people need to hear from people who are their neighbors, and they need not to be spoken to as targets in an election and then not talked to again for 2 or 4 years. They need to have an ongoing political relationship, and then after the election, they need to stay mobilized to hold politicians accountable. So we've let our elections in this country become commodified, like everything else. And I think in the last election, some of the more successful efforts of mobilization were kind of deep, old-fashioned relationship organizing, and also it gives you a feedback loop, so that everyone woke up after Election Day and shocked and horrified that Trump had won the election, though losing the popular vote, because he managed to eke out a victory in 3 Midwestern states, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, by a combined total, I think I'm right about this, of 70,000 votes, even though he lost the popular vote by 3 million. Not to dump on the Clinton campaign, but they really, in fact, kind of took those states for granted. But the people who were on the ground organizing in those states were quite well aware that we had some vulnerabilities there. And the story I've heard over and over again is that message tried to get through to the Brooklyn headquarters, and the kind of data geeks there said, no, we got that covered, our model is allowed for everything. So I think that you've got to have, if you don't have people on the ground and you don't listen to the people on the ground, then you're going to get it wrong.
Yeah, is that another example of where you refer to the data geeks and what we talked about earlier in relation to philanthropy, where you lock down the model so rigidly you can actually miss the winning prize in front of you, and you need to stay agile and, as you said, in relationship to reality, in relationship to humans. I often think about the guys who set up all these Silicon Valley ventures, whether it be Google or Facebook, and how many, or whether it be J.K. Rowling got rejected how many times. And, we need to stay responsive to opportunity, to possibility. Well, it's a state of mind, isn't it?
No, years ago, I met this guy, Bill Urey, who has written books on negotiation and wrote a book called Getting to Yes. And when I met him, I joked with him that I was in philanthropy and that we were all about getting to know, but there's unfortunately a little too much truth in that, So the way philanthropy is usually set up is as a funnel where a lot goes in at the top and almost nothing comes out at the bottom. And the whole system is designed really to find ways to say no to something. And I've often thought, I've never done this perfectly in any philanthropy that I've headed, so I don't mean to I'm criticizing myself along with others here. But I think you need to approach it so that you have some kind of open valve for what's out there. Very often in this country, which has a lot of philanthropy, Ireland and much of the rest of the world, for a variety of reasons, it's a different system. The government is more consequential in terms of funding. The amount of private philanthropy is relatively less. But in this country, which for good reasons and bad, has a strong philanthropic tradition, we don't really do enough looking for innovation and being responsive to it. So in my own modest way, I think that some of the things I'm proudest of at Atlantic and Open Society, when I had significant influence over philanthropic resources, were ideas that people came to me with that I hadn't thought of. So I remember early on, around the time I talked to Dave Isay, I had somebody come to me from the Jewish Funds for Justice, as it was then called. And that was a kind of a philanthropy which raised money in small amounts from progressive Jewish people who have a strong social justice tradition. And they would re-grant that money in relatively small grants of $5,000 or so to grassroots organizations around the country working for economic justice or racial justice or immigrant rights or women's rights. And those groups that they gave the money to would almost never be Jewish groups. They would be black or Latino or Asian or LGBT. And it was a kind of a redistribution of money for social justice. And so the people who were running this fund wanted to come to see me. I happened to know the founders of it. And they said, want to come and talk to you? Or maybe I asked to talk to them. I said, I've been looking at your grant making, and I'm trying to understand, because 20 years ago I was new to this, the world of grassroots organizing, and it seems to me you could really teach me a lot about it. Will you come and talk to me? And I said, but it's not about money. I'm not about giving money to the Jewish Funds for Justice. I think I just want to be educated by it, if you don't mind. So they came and they talked, and I learned a lot. And at the end of it, the woman who was my friend who had brought in there said to me, cleared her throat and said, and we'd like you to consider $1 million, for the Jewish Funds for Justice. And I said, nice try. I told you not to ask for money, but good try, but no. And she left. And then I thought, why not? I thought, actually, we're not set up as a big philanthropy to make a lot of grassroots groups. They're doing a very good job of it. Why don't we just give them money to do it? And we did. So I'm saying this story partly to flatter myself, I suppose, at my openness to new ideas, but also to make a larger point that, if your only tool is big grants, you're not going to get to the grassroots level. You have to find intermediaries to do that. And also and this reflects a general view I have, that serendipity is a very powerful force, and you ought to be open to it. So what I've done over the years is study as much as I can. I'm talking now as a person involved in philanthropy, the way people in other fields have acted to identify, if you will, talent. In sports, how does a talent scout work? An editor. Like there was a woman, or you heard of the book Goodnight Moon, which is a classic children's book. That book and The Runaway Bunny and all those books, or the Maurice Sendak book, Where the Wild Things Are. The editor for those books was a woman named Ursula Nordstrom at, I'm now forgetting the house, but a major publishing house. And 10 years ago, they published a collection. She's dead, but they published a collection of her letters, and I bought it and read it because I was interested for some reason in it. And one of the things I learned was that she saw any writer who would come into her office and look at any manuscript. And that's how she found some of these people. A system of filters, would have probably excluded some of these works. So I looked at, what do talent scouts do? What do editors do? What do people do in fields where it's their job to identify talent? The problem is, or to identify innovation. The problem with philanthropy is that it's not really set up that way for the most part. So it's hard for people who are not already experienced at the business of grant making to find their way in the door. And so it's just a hard challenge. It's not the easiest thing in the world, particularly at a large scale, which is why when I was at Open Society and Atlantic to some extent, we had a big bias toward fellowship programs that had a totally open application process, because if you had it open and we coupled it in cities where we were active with public listening sessions where people could come and do a Q&A about how to apply, so that you actually went out of your way to find people who had ideas but wouldn't find their way to you. If you have those kinds of processes, you can really find something great. I remember when I was when we just started this fellowship program in 1996 or 7, I happened to be going out I was in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, and I'm visiting a friend, a kind of a radical Catholic priest named John Powis, who'd been involved in East Brooklyn churches, a kind of Alinsky-style organizing. And I was visiting him in the rectory, and he said, I have a couple of young NYU law students who are up in the third floor of the rectory. They're starting a immigrant rights, project, and I'd like you to meet them. So I trudged up, or they trudged down, and I met them, and they were named Una Chatterjee and Andrew Friedman, and they had this idea for an organization where lawyers would work with the community, and the whole work would be led by the community, kind of a new version of public interest lawyering, and it appealed to me a lot. And they named it Make the Road by Walking, after the famous, activist expression that you make your own path. And so I encouraged them to apply for a fellowship, and they that was about 20 years ago, and they got the fellowship. And now Make the Road all over the East Coast is a very significant organizing force, and the Center for Popular Democracy grew out of that, which is actually knitting together these efforts around the country. So I'm not taking credit for all of that, or saying that it wouldn't have happened without my bumping into them in the rectory, but it was an aspect of it, and you just have to be kind of open to ideas that you haven't had. That's the other thing I think that's really a disease in philanthropy in particular, is that people have a vested interest in their own strategies and ideas, and they don't really they're not open enough to the ideas of others. So I get a lot of credit in philanthropy for doing things like the big support for healthcare reform in 2008 and 2009 that were not my idea, that someone came to me, and then it was just my willingness to listen and think about it, and then eventually provide some backing that was critical, but it wasn't my idea. And I think there's a little too much in philanthropy of people not wanting to be associated with somebody else's idea, but they have a whole set of incentives with their trustees and all of that, to do the new thing. And I think that often ends up with programs created in a kind of laboratory that have no real legs in the world. Sometimes it works, but often not.
What about the need for philanthropy to engage in justice more than charity?
Well, yes. I mean, charity.
Let's do it.
Charity is important, but palliative, And so, overall in this country, most philanthropy is palliative, or it's aimed at services, and there's nothing the matter with that. The problem, I mean, it's a good thing to do, and people should be charitable. They should walk down the street and give to a beggar. It's very important, and a lot of individual philanthropy is along those lines. But of course, the kind of philanthropy that I've been most concerned with is concerned with the structures of oppression, if you will. And so, while I don't fault the value of palliative philanthropy, ultimately, if you don't change the systems and bring about justice, then it is just purely palliative. And so I think a lot of people are led to, who start out in a place where they just want to help people and provide services like a scholarship or fund a soup kitchen or whatever it might be, end up over time realizing that they need to go further downstream, or I guess it would be upstream. It shows you what an outdoorsman I am, to the kind of source of the problem. So, all the philanthropy I've been involved with has been involved either with the support of people doing advocacy to change policy, or leadership development, funding people who have ideas and just you run with those ideas, or funding processes like the one we funded in Ireland some years ago when things were beginning to open up there as a consequence of both the government's failures and the financial crisis, and also the erosion of authority by the Catholic Church and the sex scandal. So you had this moment, whatever it was, 8 or 10 years ago, where a country that, for a variety of reasons, was habituated to deference to authority was having something else going on. And we at Atlantic at the time wanted to support dialogues and discussions and see where that would lead. You know what I mean? Not to overcook it, just identify people who are thinking about it and bringing diverse people together. So I think those are the three mechanisms, there may be more, that I've most been associated as a philanthropist, who are, find people who are, as my colleague Martin O'Brien from Northern Ireland used to say, who most in need of the change, who are leading the change. So I have a strong bias for not for people to swoop into communities and do to them or for them, but for communities to do for themselves. And so whether that's immigrant rights organizing or LGBT organizing or trans or whatever it may be, I think you have to take your cue from the people most affected and try to get money to the people most affected to lead their own fight for change, whatever allies they may have from outside their own movements. And then I think we do a poor job in this country in general of developing leadership and I think identifying people, particularly younger people, and who are given funds to run with an idea or to associate themselves with an institution and help change that institution or build a new institution. I'm a big believer in that. And then I think there's a power in philanthropy that is often insufficiently tapped, but it's a kind of a softer power, and that is the power to bring people together or to help bring people together. But you have to be prepared for that to go to a place that you haven't planned. You have to trust people to come up with something that's best for them. And all those things are, there are plenty of progressive foundations in the United States who are allies in that kind of approach, but it's not the norm in organized philanthropy.
I want you to take me back to your college days again and the transition into your work in life or your career and how that happened. So how did the Gara that was the street organizer with the petition, how did he become the guy who was leading the waves of change in philanthropy? What was your first job, for instance, and how did that all...
Well, in the first place, while my family wasn't poor, I felt from an early, they were middle-class people, but my parents couldn't afford to send me to college just out of their own means. And so through a combination of loans and scholarship and work-study, I helped to put myself through college. So, from the time I was 14 or 16, I was always earning my own money. And I went to Colombia, which was... in New York City. I'd grown up in a small town. It was one of the leading, private institutions in the United States. I'd gone to a Catholic high school, and most of the kids in my high school didn't even bother to apply to Ivy League schools. They were steered by the brothers to Catholic institutions. And there's one thing I knew when I was getting ready to college is I did not want to be with Polish and Italian Catholic people, nothing against those, but I just needed to break out of myself, and I wanted to be in a place with different kinds of people. And so I ended up in New York. I was, it's not that I'm not a good student, but I wasn't that interested in what was on offer at college, and I was a very lackadaisical student in the sense that I got mediocre grades. I did very little work. I don't think I set foot in the library but once. I eventually took classes that were big lecture classes where nobody would miss me if I was gone. Because I was doing two other things. One is I did hook up with the American Civil Liberties Union very early. At the age of 18, through a teacher that I'd had in high school, he recommended me for a slot on an ACLU policy committee about academic freedom. And somehow or another, because it was after the 60s and the professors and the committee were looking for a student to help them get a sense of what students thought, I was nominated and elected to this committee, which had been going in the ACLU for 50 years, and all the members of it were 50, 60-ish, white male tenured professors. I was an 18-year-old, long-haired, bell-bottom wearing kid who just got out of, Catholic school in New England. But I took my place in this committee, and, it was very intimidating, but I got acclimated to it, and by the time I was 20, I was its vice chair, So it was, and then I think that older people in the ACLU took notice of me and then began to ask me to do things and take on jobs for money. Some of it was, very menial, writing minutes for meetings and helping to staff a conference, but eventually it became more of a policy role. So actually, while I was in college, I worked part-time for the ACLU. I also taught nursery school. So another byproduct of the evening I was talking about, where I went to the rally about impeachment, and I left the room and started a little group with friends, was that one of the people who followed me out was an older man who was a graduate student. And as I got to know him working on the impeachment stuff, he said to me that he had been a nursery school teacher at a school about 10 blocks north of Colombia. And they needed substitute teachers, and would I be interested? And I liked kids a lot. I'd babysat when I was in high school. And so he introduced me to some of the other teachers there, and I went to work as a nursery school teacher in a place just south of Harlem called Morningside Gardens when I was 19. And in my junior and senior year at Columbia, I worked full-time as a nursery school teacher. It was very exhilarating for me because it was the most integrated environment racially I'd ever been in. I came from a virtually all-white town. Colombia was itself in those days not very diverse, but this school drew kids from Harlem. It also had kids whose parents were involved with International House, so it had a big, diverse international population, and it had, well-off people. It had income diversity and race diversity, and it was a wonderful place to be for 4 years. So really, by the time I was a junior and senior in college, I was probably working 30 hours a week between the ACLU and the nursery school, and I went to evening lecture classes, where, as I say, nobody paid much attention to me, and somehow I managed to graduate. So if you talk to people, Columbia in recent years has kind of claimed me a bit as an alumnus and interviewed me for the Alumni magazine, and I have nothing against Columbia, it's just that I was just passing through. I sometimes wish I'd made more of my education, that I'd actually, because I only have a BA, I'm highly undereducated. I never went back to school.
Well, is it a case though that your education was in the nursery school?
Well, it was. Of course, it was. But it was, and I'm self-read and all of that. But most of what I know about politics or organizing, all that stuff, is kind of through readings I've done or people I've met, and that's true of other things too, like whatever, classical music or art. Columbia had it all to offer. I just wasn't that interested at the time because I was in a big hurry to be an adult, and between the kind of political civil liberties organizing on the one hand, and the nursery school, which was not directly political but had a kind of politics to it, and probably had as much of a formative impact on my own view of the world as anything else, because for the first time, as I say, I was in an extremely diverse environment with people who were poor, all the way up to people who were New Yorker cartoonists' kids, and it was, and the faculty was also similarly diverse, and it was, and also, this is maybe stretching it a bit, but I think there's a real unity between my own larger views of the world and how society should be organized, and what I learned about the right way to work with children. So I have a kind of a strong belief in self-direction and governance, for all people, including children. And the nursery school that I was at was a very progressive school in that sense, and it helped me see in that little universe. It kind of built. There was a world that had been built there that had values in common. I could draw a thread from that, to the work, that I've done even now.
So from there, Gara, I'm guessing you probably went on to work for the ACLU, or that work continued.
I did. I was. This was so the ACLU. So here we are in August of 2017, and we've just had the horrific events in Charlottesville, and there's a kind of a fresh discussion in this country of the free speech rights for white supremacists and neo-Nazis and so on. So the ACLU has been known for many things over the years, but in the late 1970s, they took a very controversial case where they represented the rights of a group of neo-Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, which is a community of former concentration camp survivors. And the ACLU, it was a principled stance, and I believe the correct stance. America has, as you know, a very protective approach to freedom of speech. But it cost the ACLU a lot of members. So by that time, I was a part-time staffer in the ACLU. There were 7 of us who worked for these policy committees, and each of us had a part-time job, and we were paid, I don't know, the total payroll for all of these part-time people was $18,000 in 1978 dollars. And because of the crisis brought on by the Skokie crisis, where the ACLU lost a lot of members in budget, they had to make significant budget cuts. So they took the 7 people making $18,000 total, fired us all, and created a new job of 1 person to do all that work, and that person was to be paid $11,000. And I got that job. So that was my first. So I went to work full-time for the ACLU in 1978. I was 23 years old. The next year, I was hired by a young woman who took over the New York Civil Liberties Union, which was the largest branch, to be the associate director there. So I was the number 2 person in the largest ACLU affiliate when I was 24. And then when I was 30, I moved to Texas to run the Texas Civil Liberties Union. So, and then I came back and I had a fellowship, and then I got into international human rights work, and I worked for Pan American Center, the writers organization, on their freedom of expression work. Then I went to Human Rights Watch, which was there in its relatively early days, and was the deputy director, associate director there for about 5 years. And then I had the opportunity to work in philanthropy because George Soros was creating an American branch of his philanthropy, which he had not previously done. And the president of the foundation, a man named R.A. Nair, had been my boss at both Human Rights Watch and the ACLU. And because he had apparently a very limited Rolodex, he thought about me for this job because he knew I was a little restless at Human Rights Watch. And that's how I got into philanthropy. So I was there for 11 years, running the U.S. programs of Open Society, going from $0 to $100+ million in funding virtually overnight. And then I became the president of the Atlantic Philanthropies in 2007, which was a global foundation working all over the world. So all of those things have had an element, as I say, of serendipity to them, and good luck. And being in the right place at the right time, and also, to be frank, in the earlier part of my career, benefiting in appropriately from white male privilege, and work environments where there wouldn't be searches and there weren't adequate opportunities for women and people of color to contest those jobs. So I'm aware of the fact that while I don't consider myself to come from a particularly privileged background, I think I understand Trump voters, for instance, because I have some of them in my family. I nevertheless, as a white man in the society, have at various points in my career benefited both from, from hiring processes that weren't sufficiently open, and also from all the other things that attach to privilege, like, saying something that people might pay more attention to than the same thing said by a woman down the table. And I just try to be as aware of that and as reflective of that as I can be.
And in terms of that self-awareness, do you have personal practices that you help develop yourself? Like you've said already that I suspect you're not a religious person. How have you kind of developed your sense of self and your own personal leadership?
Well, no, I'm not a religious person, although as I get older, and it's easier with Francis, who's not, who's so good in so many ways. As I get older, while I'm not particularly craving a reattachment to the institutional church, I do believe that the Gospels are a very good guide to living. So, and I've become more aware that it is, it's my faith tradition. There are many faith traditions and paths. The one I'm most familiar with is Roman Catholicism, and you can find a lot there, a great deal there, to support a social justice life. But no, I'm not particularly religious, and I've never been particularly. I've done yoga and things like that, but I'm not that into meditation or those other kinds of practices. I think, well, I don't know if it's a practice, but I try never to forget that if you have access to privilege, which is either platforms like the ACLU or Human Rights Watch, where you can provide support and solidarity to oppressed people, or when you're in a foundation where your principal tool is money, that there's only one point of having that privilege, and that is to make sure that people who are leading their own struggles for change, you're in solidarity with them. So I try to keep that uppermost. But on a more mundane level, having people around me who will give me shit, is important. So I've found, particularly since I've been in philanthropy, that there's a power dynamic you have to constantly work against, right? Because everybody will treat you as if all your ideas are brilliant and you're just the smartest person in the world. And that's just an occupational hazard, and it's very easy to get to kind of believe that. And so I've always tried to be involved in organizations where I had to raise money so that I would not forget what it was like to have to do that. And so I hear all the horror stories of philanthropy from the side of trying to raise money. I try to encourage both, whether it's my children or my wife or my friends. I don't think my friends take me as seriously as I sometimes take myself. So it's a good thing to have people who can push back on that. That's a kind of practice. It's like trying to make sure that you have people around you do that. And just as a professional, I've always been insistent on something that can sometimes be painful, but is important, and that is kind of an anonymous 360 review. So for the last 10 years or so in jobs that I've had, I've insisted that the boards create a process where, on an annual or very regular basis, my performance can be evaluated by 25 or 30 people, my staff, the board, other kinds of stakeholders, leaders of non-governmental organizations who know my work, who get interviewed by somebody anonymously. I don't know who's saying what. And then I get that feedback. And I've often been pleased with it because it can be very nice to see that people view your work largely the way you would like to have it viewed. But I've also always, there's some things that sting, where something you could do better.
Is there something that has come up that you wouldn't mind sharing a number of times?
In the stinging category? Well, I think that, I often when people share weaknesses, they're often, if you ask a job applicant, like, okay, well,
I work too hard.
Yeah.
I'm too much of a team player.
Exactly. So, you want to avoid that kind of thing. I mean, I think for me, most often what it has been over the years is I'm very good at kind of setting a tone, a leadership tone, telling the story of the organization, driving the work forward, inspiring people to some degree. Execution is not always my strongest suit. So I've learned. I've been in jobs where I've been the executor, so it's not like I can't do it. But assuring that execution takes place requires you to have a staff that can do that, and you can hold them accountable to it. And I've gotten better at that. And also, I'm a much better supporter and nurturer, whether it's as a parent or as a boss, than a taskmaster. So some of that is, I suppose, characterological. I am not as good at delivering bad news, and I don't do that as well. But I'm very good at having somebody's back, right? So as a parent, even though I know there were times when my children probably could have used more, structure or order or rules, because children actually benefit from that. I've kind of seen my role in a harsh world as to be somebody who has their back, right? And they don't seem to regret that, and I don't really regret that. And as a boss, I've been occasionally indulgent of people. I'm not the kind of I'm not as good at coming in and kind of saying, okay, you've got X amount of time to ship up or you're out. It's not my strongest suit. So other people who work for me are that way. I'm usually, I think I'm a good boss for identifying people and encouraging them to take on things they may not have thought they themselves could do, and being a good resource for them. But on the accountability end of things, it's not my strongest suit. So often the feedback that's come through the years in performance reviews, and it gets better every year because actually I listen to it and I try to do better. Although at a certain point you get to be in your 60s and you think like, well, you can change so much. It's not really worth the candle, right? You have a set of limitations and weaknesses and strengths, and while you always want to learn and improve, you could waste a lot of time trying to change fundamental aspects of your character. And I really, as time goes by, I'm somewhat less interested in doing that. But sometimes people don't always. I may think I've fired someone, but they haven't really heard it that way.
It sounds familiar. We're going to finish up now, Gara. I just want to ask, we're particularly testing times in the United States right now, and certainly internationally as well. But looking around, you've had a lifetime of work at multiple layers of activism and change and philanthropy. Where at the moment do you source the most hope?
Well, I think the most hope, in my view, lies in a resurgence of strong grassroots activism in the United States, and also there are analogs around the world, but I know the United States best. So, I think we have been living in the most vibrant time for social movement since the 1960s. So if you look at Occupy Wall Street and the young dreamers, who are challenging the deportation of undocumented people, or the campus movement against rape, or Occupy Wall Street, or Black Lives Matter. All of those things are social movements led largely by the people most affected, and they've had an effect on the discourse and on policy. If you look at the last presidential campaign, I would argue that both candidates on the Democratic side were heavily shaped by these movements, and the stances that they took on immigration, or on the economy, or on race and policing were substantially affected by that. Here's the thing, I suppose, to the way I would put it, because we've been talking about storytelling. The question is, what is the story? In this country and in much of the world, we are structured to look as a story of the person at the top of it. Who is the leader, and what is that leader doing? And the story of history is the story of this leader or that. It's, the Jacksonian era, or the Roosevelt era, or whatever. And we need good leaders, but we can't have good leaders if they are not both pushed by and held accountable by social movements. And so to me, the story needs to flip around. It has to be the story of the people who are doing the pushing, and the people who are holding people accountable. The great American progressive presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, are thought of as great because they were, or Lincoln for that matter, because Lincoln didn't start out as an abolitionist, didn't start out thinking about the emancipation of the slaves. All of those things happen because somebody, pushes, and so that's where my, my view of change happens. And when you're successful, you get a backlash. The '60s were followed by a backlash. Obama, not perfect, but kind of a reflection of these movements, was followed by what we have now with Trump. And one of the most hopeful things I read the other day, because the moment at which you catch me, we're appalled, as we are so often, by Trump. The latest thing to be appalled by is that he cannot bring himself to condemn, in specific terms, white supremacy and neo-Nazis. And he insists on this both sides are to be condemned thing without saying the words, because in fact, whether he's a white supremacist himself, he is dependent upon the support of white supremacists, which he is loath to alienate. In the Daily Stürmer, the Nazi publication yesterday, they heard his so-called statement, and they took it for what it was, which was something that was designed to minimize any, they thought it was a great statement. So that's awful, and we need to get rid of Trump, and there are various things happening to get rid of Trump, whether it's the law or other ways, and, Trump has to go. But I read a hopeful column, which was that, the fact that Trump is awful does not relieve us of the obligation to lead. So, if the president won't lead, then the people have to lead. And that, to me, is a rather hopeful sign. And eventually it'll lead to a different leader. You know, I'm excited to live in a time when so many people and so many movements are taking the reins themselves, you know, to fight for a better world and leading the way. And it's been a privilege in the job I have now and in the jobs I've had over the last 40 years to be able to provide, you know, some measure of support and solidarity.
Gara LaMarche, thanks so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Next time in Ireland.
I hope so. Thanks, Gara. Hello, Rory here again. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if so, can you please give it a share on social media and wherever you can. There are lots more great interviews in the archive, so check them out if you haven't done so already, and there are lots more in the pipeline. If you want to help sustain and grow the podcast and be part of the Love and Courage community, you can become a sponsor or a once-off or monthly patron at loveandcourage.org. And I'd also love to hear what you think of the podcast and any ideas you have for it, so please drop me an email to podcast@loveandcourage.org. Thanks so much for all your support. It really makes a difference. Here's to you and to your courageous journey in the world. Until next time.